to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My name is Merrick Gertler, and it is my great privilege to serve as the 16th President of the University of Toronto. On behalf of my colleagues, welcome to U of T and the Rotman School of Management. I'd also like to extend special greetings to the Right Honourable Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada. Prime Minister, we are delighted to welcome you back and honoured by your presence. Let me also acknowledge and welcome former Governor General and U of T alumna, the Right Honourable Adrienne Clarkson. Welcome. And a special welcome also to the Honourable Chrystia Freeland, Minister of Foreign Affairs and MP for University Rosedale. Well, it's great to see such a fantastic turnout, including so many members of the extended Rotman family and U of T family. Thank you all for joining us for what I know is going to be an absolutely fascinating conversation. So earlier this year, my colleagues here at the Martin Prosperity Institute received a call from the New York Times asking if Rotman would like to collaborate on a public event bringing journalism to life on stage here in Toronto. Of course, they responded with an enthusiastic yes. And on May 9th, here in Desautels Hall, 3 Times reporters led a stimulating and insightful conversation about Canada's welcoming of refugees from Syria. The event, which included Canada's Immigration Minister, Ahmed Hussein, was a resounding success, and the MPI team and our friends at the Times immediately started planning this second public discussion. Our topic today is of the greatest importance in current affairs, but also has profound implications for the long-term prosperity of our country and indeed the prosperity of our friends and neighbours to the south. The renegotiation of Nafta is of particular interest to Canada, but this is in addition to many concerns that have become acute over the past 6 months, affecting every aspect of our closest and most important international relationship, including the future of NATO, global refugee policy, and the implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement. Of course, these concerns are not limited to Canada. They are global in scope. We are passing through an unusual time in world history, to say the least. In such uncertain times, our government's thoughtful, principled, and strategic handling of our most important international relationship has been, I think we can all agree, highly effective. And here I should note the well-earned praise for our Foreign Affairs Minister for her deft handling of some very, very delicate files. And so credit is due, Prime Minister, to you and your government for the strong and sound leadership you are providing, not just for Canada, but also for the wider international community at a time when stability and the clear articulation of core values are so sorely needed. It has been inspiring for us to see Canada reassert its traditional role as a constructive, outward-looking, globally engaged player on the world stage. And this in turn, yes. And this, in turn, is a source of hope for all those, including the citizens of our greatest friend and ally, who share our commitment to freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So, Prime Minister, on behalf of all Canadians, thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know that we are all eager to hear today's conversation. So to get things started, I'm very pleased to invite Joseph Kahn, Managing Editor of the New York Times, to come to the podium. Please join me in welcoming him and his colleagues to the University of Toronto.
Well, I just want to offer a thank you to the Martin Prosperity Institute for hosting this terrific event here today. This is the second event that the New York Times has co-hosted with the Martin Prosperity Institute. It's a great partnership. We are, the New York Times, now taking an even bigger interest in Canada than we have historically, and some Canadians have asked me why that is, and whether this is part of a kind of American discovery of Canada that has something to do with politics in the United States. And to a certain extent, that is true. In our case, we're actually really rediscovering Canada. The New York Times has been reporting on and stationing many of our best correspondents here in Canada since before Confederation, which I'm reminded is almost exactly 150 years ago. 90 years ago, the New York Times made what was then probably the biggest investment that it ever made abroad, a $30 million in 1920 dollars investment in a company town in northern Ontario, where we ended up producing, along with Kimberly Clark, all of the newsprint for the New York Times for many years. And in 1929, the first international edition of the New York Times was flown by airplane from New York City to Montreal and distributed as a daily newspaper in Montreal. And since then, our interest has only grown. We've had bureaus in both Montreal and Toronto. And over the last 18 months or so, led by our NYT Global team, Stephen Dunbar-Johnson and Jody Rudoran, who are our leaders in that effort, prioritizing the readership in Canada and expanding the relationship that the New York Times has in Canada, investing in coverage here, has been a top priority. And we are lucky that the subject of the moment seems to have at least equal appeal, if not greater appeal, across the border. So I'm thrilled today to introduce our newest acquisition in Canada, who is someone I think known to many of you, a global correspondent and a outstanding journalist from the Toronto Star, Katherine Porter, who is now the bureau chief of the New York Times in Toronto. So please welcome Katherine.
Is it on? It is on. Okay. I'm not used to having people scream when I walk in the room like that. I could get used to it. Anyway, I'd like to bring two other people up to the stage. The first of them is my colleague, Peter Baker. He is the chief White House correspondent for the Times in Washington. Peter, will you come up and join me? You should know about Peter that he was 5 months in Jerusalem when President Trump was elected, and he was hauled back to Washington to continue his coverage from Washington. It's his fourth president that he's covered, so he knows quite a bit about Washington. And the second person I'd like to invite to the stage is the Right Honourable Justin Trudeau. So just before we start, I'll just tell you a little bit about how this is going to work so you can all relax in your seats. We're going to do 40 minutes of discussion between Peter and I and the Prime Minister, and then we will open it up to you for 20 minutes for questioning. There are people who are watching this right now on the New York Times Facebook, as well as live streaming, and they will be sending questions too, which is why I have this fancy tablet here. So I might take some questions from them also. You should know that in order to ask a question, you need to be holding a mic, and there are 6 people in the room who have microphones. They will find you if you wave your hand around madly and bring the microphone to you. So please don't try and ask a question without a microphone, because we're live streaming. not only will people in the room not hear you, but no one watching live from around the world will hear you. All right? Does that sound good? Okay, with no further ado, let's get started. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much for doing this with us.
It's my pleasure.
So we're going to start with a question that is directly from a New York Times column today, in which our colleague Max Fisher described the campaign and tactics of your office in dealing with Trump. They described it as the donut strategy, sending an army of your cabinet ministers, mayors, premiers down to not just Washington but across the United States to talk to governors and mayors and people in business to try and work around Trump. And they said that it was a donut, and he was the White House was the center of the donut. I'm wondering if you can tell us about the strategy.
I actually think of it more of as a bun. There's no hole in that donut. I mean, one of the things that people around the world don't seem to understand as much as Canadians certainly understand, and Americans too, is that there is no relationship quite like the relationship between Canada and the United States. It's not like most countries where the connections happen through leaders and diplomats. The connections between Canada and the U.S. Go through, yes, the President and the Prime Minister, but also through Congress, through senators, through governors, through mayors, and through industry, through people, businesses, entrepreneurs. We have massive levels of interconnectedness, and Canadians and Americans have always used the depth of the relationship and how we get along. Yes, it's extremely important that the President and the Prime Minister have a constructive working relationship, but the approach we've taken from the very beginning has been very much a whole-of-government approach. But I am continuing to and will continue to work directly with the President on issues where we agree, where we disagree. I spoke with him just last week. I will continue to engage with him, including on things where we have clear disagreements, like the Paris Accord, by finding things where we can work together on energy efficiencies, on fighting pollution, on always trying to find ways we can work together while, yes, that part of the story was right. We are also engaging massively at all levels, as any responsible Canadian government should.
Well, Mr. Prime Minister, you said you're going to continue to work directly with President Trump. You spoke to him last week. Tell us a little bit about that. You were one of the first world leaders to visit the White House after he took office. What surprised you about him? What did you not know about him? And tell us, how often do you talk? Does he call you at 2 a.m? You know, do you have his cell phone? Does your wife know, oh, it's him?
No, I can reassure or assure my friends in the media that any time I have spoken with President Trump, whether it be on the phone, and as far as I know, it's never been on his cell phone, and it's never been on mine. It's always through. I mean, we connect. I do have to admit, there's less sort of build-up and preparation towards calls. When was a question of talking with his predecessor, with whom I had a good relationship, it would always be a matter of weeks or at least a number of days that we knew a call was coming, and it was very much more scheduled that way, unless, of course, there was a particularly urgent issue in which it could happen immediately. But that didn't come up particularly often, if ever. With the President, the current President, it can happen much quicker, but we're always reporting fully on the conversations we have. I mean, he's a businessman, a deal maker. He's someone who knows how to interact socially at a very effective level. And one of the things that I've learned is he actually does listen. He will be no. I mean, you've got a lot of. I can understand the laughter, but there's a lot of politicians who have a deep vested interest in being right all the time, and therefore close themselves off sometimes to facts or evidence or differing opinions. What I've found from this president is he will listen to arguments made. He will look the ensemble of facts, of proposals, of impacts you put together, and he will be open to shifting his position, and that's something we can definitely work with. The other thing is, I will say, and yes, I mean, it's not so much an elephant in the room because it's sort of the topic of this conversation. There's lots of things we disagree on in our approach, and as there will always be between a Canadian Prime Minister and an American President. But I have always found that whenever he has made an engagement to me or a commitment to me on the phone or in person, he has followed through on that. And that's someone you can work with.
Can I follow up real quickly? A specific example. We have read that Jared Kushner calls your staff to say, the president's about to rip up NAFTA. Can you call? Tell us a little bit about that. What happened, and what was that conversation like?
Well, there is ongoing. I mean, one of the first things we did when the election happened in the United States is we realized that as the Liberal Party of Canada, we had better institutional connections with the Democrats in the state than we did with the Republicans, although we always had good cross-partisan relationships, although the incoming Republican president had different networks than traditional Republicans. So we realized we had to get connected with the folks who were coming in to form government for the next 4 years. So we dispatched on a number of different levels, Christia, people in my staff, to start talking with the new administration in what we knew would be one of the most important relationships, not just for us, but for the United States as well. And we developed a good working relationship with the president's team. So there's lots of back and forth when there are issues, as one would hope between any two capitals. When there are issues of importance, we go back and forth. Indeed, we'd heard that the president would probably appreciate a call from me to talk about NAFTA, and I reached out to him. We talked. I highlighted the fact, fairly straightforward, I thought, that in any trade deal, particularly one 25 years old, there have been a certain momentum and a certain habit and businesses and jobs that are created through that. To terminate it suddenly would be far more disruptive than renegotiating it, even if theoretically one could imagine a much better deal sometime down the road. The short-term pain would be so significant for so many Canadians, but also so many Americans, that we really should move forward on renegotiating or updating NAFTA as it's been updated a dozen times over the past 25 years, that there was an openness to that.
So it's sort of a reverse donut strategy then that they're using too.
So there's too many levels in there that they're using, or so they're not going around me?
Well, their round is coming to you. How about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, I'm having good conversations with governors, with Congress, with the business people. I met this morning with Mary Barra to talk about our obvious interest in the auto pact between Canada and the U.S. and the great collaboration we have between Canada and the United States in auto, but in so many businesses. It's an ongoing, constant conversation because this relationship matters.
I'm wondering if he's ever asked you for advice.
Sure. Sure. I mean, the reason I'm thinking of it is we have genuine conversations that cover a broad range of issues. For certain, we tend to focus more on the areas in which we agree, and our approach on them is always going to be thoughtful and engaged. I mean, for me, as I've said many times, Canadians expect me to do two things, compatibly and consistently. which is stand up for Canadian values and interests, but also have a constructive working relationship with the administration of our largest trading partner and most important friend and ally. And that's exactly what I'm going to stay focused on as my job.
Help us out, though, to understand Minister Freeland's speech the other day, which was highly noticed by not just Canadians but Americans. And well, I don't think President Trump's name came directly in that speech. If it did, it was certain. Okay, it was not. Confirmation. Tell us what it meant, though. Tell us what message you, through her, were hoping to send to President Trump, to the world. What is Canada's role today in Trump's world that might be different than it was in Obama's world?
Christia gave an extraordinary speech, and it's a strong statement of how Canada engages with the world. But it's, not to take anything away from him, it's a bit of a sequel. In 1948, Louis Saint Laurent gave a speech defining Canada as having an independent foreign policy from Britain at that point that said that for which Canada's foreign policy was just an extension of British foreign policy. And since that moment, we have always had an independent-minded foreign policy. Obviously, we are broadly aligned with many of our friends and values, but the choices we make have always been based on Canadian values, Canadian priorities, a Canadian approach to solving problems. And I've often pointed out, even close friends like the United States, even on military matters, for example, they don't want Canada to either be or be seen as simply an extension of American policy. It is useful to our friends and allies, and certainly useful to the world, but most of all useful to Canadians, that we be seen as our own path, our own strength, our own ability to choose how, where, and when to engage. So it is a reaffirmation of a long-standing Canadian principle of independence of approach, consistent with the values that we and so many of our allies stand for.
Your counterpart in Germany, Angela Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, said that after the G7 meeting and the NATO meeting, that Europe, anyway, could no longer rely on the United States the way it had in the past. Is that your view about Canada?
No, Canada will always be, just through sheer proximity, through history, but also through present engagement and intertwinement of our geographic, social values, economic realities, always find the United States to be extremely relevant, and we will always work with. I mean, Europe can make its own choices, and it's going through its own challenges right now. But certainly for us, having a good, constructive relationship with the United States, where we work together on the things that we need to work together on for the benefit of our citizens, and where we find moments where we're going to disagree respectfully on what is in our interest or our approaches, it's particularly interesting and causing discussion now, but I don't think it's fundamentally different than how Canadians have always engaged with the United States. The relationship goes so much further than just president to prime minister. It was a former Canadian prime minister, and I can't remember quite which one, but it likened it to sleeping beside an elephant. No matter how even-tempered the beast, you're affected by every twitch and grunt.
It was interesting, though, in Minister Freeland's speech, she painted a fairly bleak future for the United States. She said, the narrow pursuit of national self-interest historically has led to nothing but carnage and poverty. Is that your vision of the U.S. right now?
I think one of the things we do need to remember is the United States is a democracy, a great democracy, that has a multiplicity of views and perspectives within its country. And there will be people who will be turning inwards at the same time as other people turn outwards. And I think regardless of how central the President and his administration is in defining American policy, to take an issue like climate change and the Paris Agreement. We're seeing American states and municipalities and big cities and businesses moving forward in a very open, progressive way. So to try and narrow or apply that perception to the entirety of the United States, I think, well, as an American, you might disagree.
Well, far be it for me to disagree with you. But as somebody who covers President Trump, every conversation eventually comes around to Twitter. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. How do you have your phone set to buzz when he tweets something about Canada? Mine buzzes when he tweets. Or does somebody on your staff, are they assigned in the Situation Room of Canada to look out for Trump tweets and see what trade war might be threatened today?
I think modern means of communications has led to adjustments in how we function in a large way. There's no question that the way the president chooses to speak directly to people through social media is a new wrinkle in international diplomacy. Anything the President of the United States says in any forum is worthy of noting, of placing into context, and trying to say, okay, is this something that is a matter? It matters to us. Is it something that we need to react to? Is it something that has implications for us? And in general, I think we've been pretty able to understand what's going on without reacting in to a similar level.
But no, are you in bed like the rest of us looking at Twitter at night?
No, I tend to focus on the things I need to do, on my job and how I do it, and if important things come up, then I hear about them in my morning briefing. And if I get woken up at night for something, it better be more important than a tweet. By anyone. I mean, that's...
I'm wondering if his approach to Twitter, though, and how he uses Twitter has changed you and or has influenced your approach to Twitter at all.
I recognized early I was one of the even as a backbench MP 10 years ago, I was using social media more effectively than most of my peers. Part of it was that I have a slightly higher profile, had even back then a slightly higher profile than some of my fellow MPs. But also, I understood early on the power of an authentic, genuine voice, where people in this modern social media society appreciate being able to directly hear and see and learn what someone thinks in a less filtered way than the media has always been necessary for to get messages out in the non-social media world. So I appreciate the value of connecting with people authentically. I just find as Prime Minister, I have plenty of occasions to speak directly to Canadians and engage with them. It's not something that I need in order to get out of the bubble that does surround you when you're running a government. And that's a choice that I make. I try and do as many open, engaged initiatives like this where I can take questions and I can express myself clearly. I don't need to use that at this point in my career.
If anything, I would say that, instead of being impulsive, you've been accused of being like staged. That when you were jogging through the group of graduates and your photographer happened to take a photo of you, was that staged?
No.
It wasn't staged. What happened then?
Well, I run. I run a few times a week, and one of the things that I've found is it's easier often for me to run on the road than it is at home, because when I'm at home and I end a day at work, I want to go home and spend time with my kids and my wife, and my days are really full, so taking an extra half hour to run and all the cool down time afterwards is taking time away from my family. So when I'm out on the road, I run, and I travel with my EA and photographer and a few other people. They are both runners too, and Adam, our photographer, got taking a series of me running in Strasbourg, in Paris, in Washington D.C., and he doesn't mind running with a camera on. He saw a grad group in front of me, and I saw him stop, and I'm like, okay, watch, I'm going to take off my shirt. That actually wasn't in any of the picture series, but there's a first picture I don't think he got of me saying, yeah, I'll take off my shirt to be in the background, because it was a thing, and he shook his head. And then I ran through it, and he snapped the picture, and then the kids spotted me, and I turned back and said hi. So it was one of those things that just happens, but I do recognize sort of what the cynics in journalism and others are saying. Oh no, there's all these moments that I do things. I'm an active person. I like people. I will stop for selfies. I feel that opportunities to connect in a way that is true to me with people are helpful, and that was an example of it.
All right, so all those kids outside who are waiting for you will be looking for your running route later today.
It'll be in Mississauga.
We talked about other ways of reaching out to the Trump White House. One of the ways you did, you took Ivanka Trump to Broadway to see Come From Away, which my wife and I saw. It's a fabulous show. Why did you do that? What did you talk about? And have you talked to her since then?
Haven't spoken with her since then, but engaging with Ivanka on the Women's Council, the Women's Leadership Council, which was a great thing that actually was speaking with Mary Barra about this morning, the head of GM, about how we're going to make sure that it really does move the needles for women entrepreneurship. I mean, this is something that matters deeply to me as a feminist, but also as someone who is committed to growing the economy in ways that includes opportunities for everyone. We know that getting more women to succeed in business is not just the right thing to do, it's a really smart thing to do for economic growth. So that's something that's real. We connected obviously around that Growth Council, and then when we saw that there was a big premiere for this extraordinary story of the relationship between Canada and the United States, and how during some of the darkest moments that we all lived through of the past couple of decades on September 11th, we were able to tell these stories of being there for each other, of positivity, of hope, even through sort of the grief and the fear and the uncertainty, and highlighting an extraordinary part of Canada and Come From Away. I mean, this was all something that I said, okay, we've got to share this story with the U.S., with the world, and I'll go down and I'll bring more attention to it, invite folks from the UN, and we invited the President and his family to come down. President Trump couldn't make it, but Ivanka was happy to come, and it was boosting and showing concretely the story of the tremendous friendship between Canada and the United States that goes through thick and thin, through tough times and good times.
Did you cry? We cried.
Oh, I cried repeatedly.
Did Ivanka cry?
About 6. I can't remember. I didn't notice. She was more discreet about it. I'm sort of a baller who sobs, and it's not a pretty look. You guys weren't filming that, was it? That's not a good look for me.
I'm wondering if, when you were recently at the G7 meeting, if other heads of state have come to you for advice on how to deal with Trump.
The Trump whisperer.
Not directly. I mean, we all have different imperatives at home. We all have different ways of dealing with whether we're coming up on an election cycle, and whether people want us to be harder or softer. There's a lot of things that go into how various leaders choose to engage. But we were actually quite open about what our approach was, and how creating connections with different people within the administration, and we may have, or we did, and a few times connect people from different countries with particular peoples within the administration that they didn't that we thought would fit. The initiative around what we did with women entrepreneurship and leadership was then picked up by Angela Merkel on apprenticeship and training, and that was a successful little piece of that visit that we're happy to sort of share and work to create better relationships between people. I mean, that's one of the things that Canada tries to do. We're here to help. Can we connect people? Can we all get along? I mean, this is something that Canada's good at.
Well, you recently had dinner with the former president, Barack Obama. You tweeted out, I think, a picture of the two of you having dinner. What did you talk about? Did you both sit there and compare notes about this guy who's come after him? And did he have any advice for you about how to deal with him? How are these two people different?
How are these two people different? Obviously.
Okay. How are they the same? Shorter question.
Being President of the United States is from what I've seen, and I've seen closer than most, is a very difficult, very important, very complex job, and people approach it in different ways, obviously, but there is an importance and an impact in that job that sits with you. And obviously, Barack was reflective less about what he had been through and more about the next steps and how he can move into more of a promoting the next generation of leadership. How do we get young people to be more engaged and active in their communities? And things that he worked on, obviously, as president, but now we'll be able to devote more time to. I'm Minister for Youth in my government. I've always been a youth activist and advocate, and before I was a teacher. So getting and empowering young people was a big topic of conversation that we spent an awful lot of time on.
Part of this, I hate to say, trolling by the former president, because he got together with you, he got together with Angela Merkel, he got together with David Cameron. He's sort of like doing a G7 reunion tour of all the people who are kind of mad at President Trump right now.
I don't know. I think my relationship and the genuine friendship that I've struck up with Barack Obama is more than just being a pawn in some public PR. But they do point out that journalists are a bit cynical. So I mean, maybe there's that. I think he's
fake news.
Serious about engaging with the world, and I was glad to sit down and catch up with an old friend who has a lot of insight into where the world needs to go.
I have two questions for you. Brian Mulroney has been speaking recently about his role for your government as one of the emissaries in the Army going down to the United States. I'm wondering, I don't think we've ever heard from you about the decision to ask him to do that, how that came about. It's been called people have reported it to be quite revolutionary for a Liberal Prime Minister to reach back and tap the shoulder of a Conservative former Prime Minister. Can you talk about why you did that, how that came about?
First of all, that's not true. I was pleased to ask former Prime Minister Kim Campbell to step up and help me choose our newest Supreme Court Justice, and she's helping in this next process as well as we're doing it. I have a tremendous respect for anyone who is Prime Minister of this country or has been Prime Minister of this country. I've approached Joe Clark on a number of initiatives as well. I talk regularly, obviously, with my Liberal predecessors. I take it as a value. I mean, Canadians haven't always been great around finding roles for or drawing on the expertise and strengths of our former prime ministers. Some of it may be partisanship, but some of it is just, we got a new person in place now, we forget the old one. Maybe because I spent a lot of years with a former prime minister, I know they still have an awful lot to offer even after having been prime minister, and therefore drawing on Brian Mulroney for his thoughtful and significant engagement with the Republican Party in the States, and specifically with a number of the people around Trump, just made sense. So yeah, it made. And I've always had a very decent and cordial relationship with Brian Mulroney, and I'm not I guess in some cases people might be worried that it means I suddenly agree with him on everything. I think it's clear enough that Trudeau's and Mulroney's disagree on a number of things that I don't have to go out of my way, and I can instead focus on the things that we do find alignment on. And I think in that sense it's been not just of a benefit to me, it's been of a benefit to Canada and to all political parties to be able to see so clearly the cross-partisan collaboration on this issue. And I will also say, and this isn't common for a politician to say, but the other political parties, particularly the Conservative Party of Canada, has been very positive and thoughtful in their engagement with the United States in a way that is constructive and helpful. I was raised with the perspective that, when you're outside of Canada's borders, you don't bring your domestic squabbles with you. You all speak as Canadians, and the Conservatives specifically have been very helpful in ensuring that Americans in all different aspects of the administration and the country understand that Canada is really solidly united and speaks with a not one voice, many voices, but many voices saying the same things, which has really been helpful as well.
You mentioned having differences. One of them, of course, as you mentioned, is the Paris Climate Accord. Secretary Mnuchin was here to visit last week. Is there a way forward? Did you guys talk about a way forward in which the United States actually would try to renegotiate Paris, or if that's not possible, negotiate something outside of Paris with big countries like Canada and Europe?
We're not reopening and renegotiating Paris. That's simply not on the table. It was an awful lot of work getting to the consensus we did, and it's a good deal. It's the right deal. It's the path forward for the world, and it's a clear market signal, amongst other things, that people are adjusting and pricing in, and we're not going back on that. And regardless of what the U.S. federal government did on Paris, a huge part of Canada's pan-Canadian framework and carbon pricing within our own country and two of our biggest provinces relied on partnership with American states and the California Climate Initiative. So there's no question that whether or not the U.S. is part of Paris as a signatory, different parts and folks and industries and areas of the United States are very much moving forward in that direction. So I'm not overly worried about the dip in American leadership or American sort of unanimity or cohesion on Paris, because there is such a recognition that this is the way the world is going, and it's about competitiveness, it's about future generations, it's about getting both the environment and the economy to work together, that everyone understands. So we're going to keep moving forward, and indeed I will continue to work with President Trump on initiatives around the environment that may or may not fit within the Paris Accords, but that will show leadership on reducing pollution, on moving forward in the right direction. Okay,
then if it's not possible to renegotiate Paris, is it possible to negotiate something different, as President Trump talked about? And did you talk about that with Secretary Mnuchin?
I didn't meet with Secretary Mnuchin, but we're always looking for better coordination and collaboration on issues around energy, issues around environmental impacts, pollution, issues that go across borders, and with President Obama and President Peña Nieto at our North American Leaders Summit last June, a year ago, we very much talked about a continental approach on energy issues that was always going to be separate but complementary to Paris, and I'm always looking for ways to collaborate with our neighbors.
You mentioned carbon pricing. Can you envision a scenario in which Canada has to or chooses to impose a carbon tariff on the United States?
I don't believe in thickening of borders. I don't believe in penalizing. I think in moving forward, we will always look at what actions and whether trade is fair between Canada and the United States. But that argument that people are making that if we move forward on pricing carbon, we will somehow be less competitive in our engagement with the United States, I think is extraordinarily short-sighted. First of all, Canada will always focus on being competitive with the United States in multiple ways. We need to. But at the same time, if the United States slows down on its moving towards the future on climate change, that can be an opportunity for Canada to step up, to be innovating, to draw in investors and partners from the United States and from around the world that do understand that this is the way the world is going, and Canadian leadership, Canadian innovation, Canadian values give us a tremendous opportunity. So I'm going to continue to ensure that, first of all, Canadian climate policy will be determined in Canada by Canadians, and second, Canadian economic policy will be consistent with the values that we have, which are both, yes, being competitive, but also being very forward-thinking.
I'm interested in today's New York Times. Max Fisher spoke to Brian Mulroney's former chief of staff, and he said there is no plan B. Is there a plan B if NAFTA falls apart, and what is it?
We have, over the past years, been emphasizing diversification of the Canadian economy. We've signed a historic progressive trade deal with Europe that is giving us access to a 500 million person market that is going to be great for Canadian consumers, Canadian businesses to export towards Europe. We continue to be very constructively engaged with the growing economies of Asia. As a Pacific country, we have tremendous opportunities to engage, to partner, to grow there as well. But regardless of how much we're able to stretch east and stretch west, Canada's still Canada. We're connected to the United States in such a deep and significant way that there will always be a need for great integration between our two economies. The big point that I made when we all made when we first were engaging with the new administration was Canada is far more important to the United States than the United States realizes. There is no trading relationship, there is no relationship between two countries in the history of the world as close and as effective as Canada. We're talking about $1 trillion in trade. For the U.S., Canada is a bigger market than China. We are a source of tremendous jobs and prosperity for the United States. And the idea that an administration could go against the will of, the 9 million or so jobs that directly depend on Canada and the United States, the industries that have benefited from the close collaboration, the people-to-people ties that are deep and effective of two countries that have grown up together and are extraordinarily complementary and compatible in so many things. I mean, there's no need for a plan B. We will continue to engage in a constructive thoughtful way. And like I said, NAFTA's been improved a dozen times over the years, and we will do it again to update it to what the challenges we're facing now are.
So when Katherine shows up in your office a year from now, what are the percentage odds that we're going to still be in a free trade pact? 90%, 100%, 75%?
Oh, next year, 100%.
4 years from now?
Who knows? I can guarantee you we'll be in plenty of trade deals, and NAFTA will remain a hugely important and successful trade deal for both of our countries. I can understand the politics around saying that, we need to improve it, it's terrible. The facts don't necessarily bear that out, though. It's created massive numbers of jobs in both of our economies. It's created tremendous advantages. The steel issue is another issue that keeps popping up now. We have an amazingly sophisticated and specialized market in steel between our two countries, where we trade about $2 billion worth of steel into the United States every year, but the U.S. trades about $5 billion worth of steel into Canada. and anything you do to thicken the border will significantly hurt both sides of the deal. So I fundamentally believe in the fact that both the American administration and my administration are focused on doing things that benefit our citizens and making sure that those jobs continue and Canadians and Americans prosper is something we're always going to agree on.
Well, you mentioned steel. If you tweeted that if the U.S. invokes a section of the U.S. Trade Expansion Act regarding steel, that, quote, we will take major action if necessary. What did you mean by that?
I just think, I mean, people on the face of it would find it a little silly if they realize that the United States is investigating whether or not there are national security concerns on trading steel with Canada. There are no two countries in the world that have a better collaboration around NORAD, around members of the Five Eyes, intelligence sharing of what we do with our brave men and women of the Canadian forces and the U.S. Army standing side by side on battlefields around the world, that suddenly trade in steel between Windsor and Detroit might be a national security issue is just silly. So we've certainly pointed out, and I made this point directly to the President, that Canada has no business being on a list of possible national security concerns, and I am confident that we're moving in the right direction on that.
What would major action, though, look like? Well, your phrase. I'm
not going to go into hypotheticals on that, because we know that there is pretty much no country on earth that has a bigger vested interest in the U.S. being successful than Canada does. Even if our economy is going great, if there's a dip in the U.S. economy, we feel it. We know that in any trade deal, in any trade relationship, mutual benefit is really the only thing that is of benefit. So, in general, we are not going to respond to saber rattling with more saber rattling. We're going to stick to facts and being reasonable about things, and that's what we'll stick to.
Okay. Well, we could push you on that for a long time, but the clock says that it's time for you all to get a chance to ask questions. You've been really patient, and thank you for that. So stick your arm up, wave it around madly. We'll try and go from one side to the other, and I will read these too. We'll go back and forth. So who is going to start?
Maybe the Prime Minister should choose who gets to ask the first question.
No, I'll let the moderator be the heavy on this one.
Oh, okay.
Katherine, you go.
I'm choosing. I thought you guys were choosing. Okay, I will choose this gentleman right here. It's coming to you right now. Hold on. Take the mic, please, sir.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Premier Ministre. Ron Dums. I'd like to ask a question around trade. When we look at different challenges like Bombardier's planes into the U.S., the repercussions around subsidies and tariffs, and how big do these things cloud up the challenges in trying to get the real facts about how important that relationship is with us?
We will always base our argumentation on real facts. The fact is, what we've seen, the Bombardier issue, there are thousands of small companies and jobs across the United States that are direct suppliers to Bombardier. And pointing out that any actions against a Canadian company that we believe in deeply and will defend is not going to just hurt relations between our two countries and choices we may make around procurement, but also impact American jobs and American companies. Americans tend to understand fairly quickly that they're embarking upon no-win scenarios, not because we'll win, we'll lose too if they move forward, but they'll lose as well, and it's up to them, and it's up to us to make that clear in different ways, and we will continue to do that. Merci beaucoup.
Hold on, we have to go. I promised to go the other way. Okay, so you're going to run over. There's a gentleman with pink right there. Can you run over to him, please?
Keep your hand up, sir. Wait for the mic.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Patrick McLean with Albion College in Michigan. One of the issues you haven't touched upon is the refugee issue. And clearly there's a humanitarian aspect to that, but there's also an economic development aspect to that. Have you had any conversations with the President about the economic development aspect of that? And is it in Canada's interest to see something other than the sort of Fortress America approach taken on that issue?
Yes, I've had conversations with the President about that. I mean, he was actually very interested in how we do immigration in general on a points-based system, because that's something that Canada's been very, very successful with. I mean, one of the reasons we've been able to welcome in over 40,000 Syrian refugees over the past year and a half is because it wasn't just a government drive. Canadians, church basements, community groups, from municipalities or provinces, all stepped up and said, we want to help, we want to do more, not just out of goodness, although there's a lot of that around. It's also understanding that bringing in people who will contribute and be grateful and raise their families and help build a better country is a great pathway towards economic growth and opportunity. So, but the reason we're able to do that is because Canadians understand that that has been the story of immigration, that we've never played up security or immigration. It's always, no, we never flinch on security, and we ensure that we're open to immigration at the same time. And that's a process that has been very much understood by Canadians, and it's also a responsibility for me to defend when you have a population that is positively inclined towards immigration. You have to continue to demonstrate that we have a rigorous process, that there is no giving on security, and that we can actually have all the benefits of it without taking undue risks, and that's something precious to protect. In terms of advantages, I've been chatting with tech companies and American companies about the global skills strategy that we just put on that allows companies in Canada to bring in top global talent in 2 weeks if they are the kinds of people who are then going to turn around and hire all sorts of Canadians for their shop and tool up and skills and demonstrate true benefits to our economy. So openness to immigration isn't just a humanitarian thing. It's cold, hard business sense in a competitive environment, and people are noticing, not just in the United States, but around the world.
There's a gentleman named Alex Boone who's sent a question through Facebook. The question is Canada safeguarding itself against Russian interference in its future elections?
Absolutely. We take very seriously what has been obviously a pattern of disruption by cyber actors, including Russian cyber actors, of democratic processes. We saw it in the United States. We saw it in France. We've seen it coming in Germany. We're also seeing it now in Latvia, where Canada has taken on a framework nation lead role in defending the Eastern Front of NATO as a key actor. There are sort of cyber and propaganda attacks against us there. I have tasked our Elections Canada and our Minister of Democratic Reform to work with all political parties to strengthen our data systems and communication systems so that they are less vulnerable to disruption or outright attacks from cyber actors of any origins.
How about over there? We haven't had anyone over there. There's a woman with her right up. Yes, you. Wait, there's a person next to you with a microphone. Please use it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. My question is about the fact that the Trump administration and even his campaign has fueled anti-immigrant sentiments. And we're beginning to see more of that in Canada. Recently, somebody wanted to be treated by, an immigrant doctor. We've seen somebody screaming, go back to China at a store, and I can just keep going on. I know you've been a big champion for women, and I must commend you for that, Honorable Prime Minister. But what are you doing to make sure that this anti-immigrant sentiment that's building up in the U.S. does not infiltrate Canada?
Well, I think we are always seeing moments of examples of intolerance around the world, and Canada is certainly no exception. I mean, we're not some magical place that is immune to the kinds of forces that that people have seen. Our last election campaign, the one in which I got elected, featured anti-Muslim rhetoric and snitch lines and headscarves initiatives. That, quite frankly, Canadians had to make a choice about rejecting or accepting. And I think one of the things we understand is when people are uncertain about their own jobs, their own future, the economic success of their family, of their community, it's easier to get people to point fingers and try and look for an other to blame. And where Canada has always done extraordinarily well is understanding that diversity is a source of strength, that pulling together across communities isn't just making for more resilient communities, it's also making for more creative communities. That's one of the reasons why the tech world is so interested in hiring University of Waterloo grads, who are the #1 export from Canada to Silicon Valley, because the diversity of different voices, different perspectives, working on the same problem is a tremendous advantage in getting great results. But we have to be vigilant because, yes, we're always going to be able to point out ignorance and intolerance and prejudice. And what we have to do is emphasize the reaction. When a mosque gets graffitied in Cold Lake, in a small town in Alberta, the entire community came out to clean off the walls of the mosque. When 6 men were gunned down in a Quebec City mosque, the entire city came out to stand with their Muslim brothers and sisters. When there's intolerance against new immigrants or whatever it is, the reaction has to be strong. I mean, Canada is a great place, but it didn't happen by accident. And it won't continue without effort. Part of that is recognizing the mistakes of the past, whether it be our terrible mistakes around Indigenous peoples and why we need to move forward on reconciliation and building a true partnership there, whether it's recognizing events like the internments during the World Wars or the Komagata Maru or the St. Louis, which were ships which were turned away because of racism and intolerance in times of need. Mistakes that we've made, we have to acknowledge and commit ourselves to do better. And yes, there is still troubling examples of intolerance that spike up every now and then, and the response to that is for the rest of us to pull together and say, you know what, that doesn't work here in Canada. Our nights are too long, our winters are too cold, and our communities are too spread out. We need to lean on each other. We need to be there for our neighbors. It's part of the psyche of this country to understand that Canadian identity is based on shared values, not a specific identity either anchored in the past or a homogeneous identity now. Our identity is diverse and our values are shared, and that's what makes it so easy to say that we all get to be Canadian regardless of what we look like or sound like, because we have the same hopes and dreams for our kids and our future and our country as our neighbors.
I feel like we could end it there and all start singing together, "Oh Canada," in multiple languages right now. But
a few more days till July 1st.
We have time for one more question, and I don't think I took a question from this section, right? I didn't. So just in the interest of fairness, there's this gentleman here sitting next to John Hondrick, my old boss, right there, and he can go ahead. You're the last question.
Hi there. I'm wondering, what is any challenges or factors of your job and your role that you didn't expect coming in, and now that you've had to deal with?
One of the things that I am most grateful for in my life is the fact that when I was a kid, I got to travel across this country and meet people of every possible different community and background and get to know Canadians. And all through my life, people would find out that I was a son of the Prime Minister, and then they'd start talking to me about Canada. I mean, small talk for them would be, oh, hey, you know, where do you think Canada's going? What's great about this country? And I was a snowboard instructor, right? And they'd still get in these big philosophical conversations about the nature of our country as soon as they found out my last name. And the fact is, a lifetime of those conversations has deeply informed my view of this country and my capacity to continue, I hope, to serve it with everything I have in a way that is both mine and thoughtful, but also very much anchored in what Canadians are living and being and doing. Since I've become Prime Minister, I have realized that it is more difficult for me to have those kinds of open, thoughtful conversations with random people. I'm surrounded by brilliant people, great MPs and ministers who serve, who are thoughtful, or representatives for their communities. But I'm now finding it that I have to make deliberate efforts to connect and have just regular conversations with people, because I live in a little bubble right now that I have to keep trying to push out. That's why last year, or earlier this year, January, I did 10 open town halls or more than 10 open town halls across the country, where I just sat for an hour and a half, and took random questions from random people who wanted to talk about how their country was going. And for me, that need that I will always have to stay grounded and connected in the people I have the incredible opportunity to serve is a huge responsibility, but it's one that I'm surprised with how mindful and deliberate I have to now be about something that I'll admit I took for granted for the rest of my life, that I could just have great conversations with people about their life and their future because of the way I was raised.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So my name is Jameson Stevie. I'm the executive director of the aforementioned Martin Prosperity Institute. There is nothing more Canadian than our Prime Minister saying we're not a magical place, and then proceeding to spend 10 minutes explaining to everyone subtly how we're a magical place. So thank you for living our values in that sense. We're going to have to say goodbye and thank you to the Prime Minister. He has another event to go to, but before he goes, just speaking to in an apolitical way, the MPI is very proud to host this today, and someone said, so how did you get the Prime Minister? And not to blow up your calendar, Mr. Prime Minister, but we asked. And the fact that you have a desire to pierce the bubble that descends upon you in the form of black Yukons and the rest, to speak with regular people, I encourage you, regardless of your politics, to keep that up, because that's going to make you an effective leader and us a better country. So with that, if you can stay seated, and please say thank you to the Prime Minister and to his staff, as always. Yes.